Hello and welcome to In Conversation with WLV Doctoral College. I'm Dr. Deborah Curitan and I'm an Associate Professor of Equity in Learning and Teaching working in the Doctoral College at the University of Wolverhampton.
And I'm Ben Halligan, I'm Director of the Doctoral College.
So today's vlog, we wanted to talk about word counts. We get asked loads of questions about word counts when we hold our PGR hangouts. I think it's one of the sort of big topics that lots of students talk about and a bone of contention for a lot of people. So we are planning to talk about word counts on both a practical level and a regulatory level. So first of all, Ben, I think it's worth talking about basically why we have a word count and what happens if somebody goes over the word count.
We have one for reasons of parity. It's to ensure that the theses that are examined all hit the required word count, and there's no sense that somebody has to write a bit more than somebody else who writes a bit less. I mean, it's basically, this is the level and you all need to hit that certain level. I say level because you have different word counts in terms of different disciplines. So number one, it's parity, but also number two, I think it gives you a sense early on of the scope, of the size, of the freedoms, and of the limit of the thesis that you're expected to put together. I mean, at a certain point, it has to end, it has to stop. And this is an indication of where and when it should stop. I mean, I think typically, you know, for the first 6 months or even longer in talking to new doctoral researchers, it's often about focusing in, finding greater definition of a project. And that at the point of an initial application, you sometimes have a project that would be fine for 2 or 3 PhDs and would take years and years, but you need to kind of focus in. And part of that focus is understanding how what you're proposing to research would spread across the field of the word count.
So what happens when people go over their word count? Because we have this conversation with our own PhD students on a regular basis about there is a word count at Wolverhampton. It's not plus or minus 10%. There's a maximum word count. And there are ramifications to going over that word count. So at Wolverhampton, for instance, if you go over your word count, you're going against a regulatory position, and as a result of that, your thesis can be returned by the registry office, and you will be asked to reduce the word count before you submit. But there are other issues, aren't there? So, for instance, if we were to send out a thesis that's significantly over the word count to examiners can actually choose just to examine up to the maximum word count. So what will happen is that maybe some of your, the best bits of your thesis don't get read. And you can guarantee if you go over your word count, then you're going to have likely have major modifications. We don't have that category at Wolverhampton, or a resubmission, which is the category that we do have at Wolverhampton. So you're going to be asked to significantly rewrite your thesis, and that's going to take you out of the realms of minor modifications.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, there are regulations in respect of what needs to be in a thesis in terms of how it's presented and so forth, and size is one regulation. And if you break that regulation, you've submitted something that examiners may decline to examine, or they may do, as you say, which is stop at a certain point. I mean, from a parity point of view, it's unfair if one person's hit the requisite word count or come in under it to allow the next person to go over it, because I'm sure they've both struggled equally. Also, I think it kind of blocks out a lot of space that you might need. So when you're in the final phase, perhaps, of doing a PhD, I wouldn't aim to bring it in within 100 words of the absolute maximum word count, because you'll find other stuff you need to put in which will push you over. But also in terms of the conversation with the examiners at a Viva, it's very probable they're going to want some other things added. And if you've already used all the space to add other stuff, then you're going to have to first take material out to add other stuff. So it makes life a lot harder. It doubles the amount of work. The word count, the maximum, is an indication of where you're aiming for, but it's not where you must aim for. I mean, it's quite usual for a thesis to be, you know, a fair few thousand words under, but having covered everything sufficiently, that's completely fine. So my advice would be not to make life more difficult, but aim into that area, but don't necessarily aim to maximize the area. I mean, think about, if you're, we're just after Christmas, if you're loading up a plate, you don't want to kind of completely load it so that things are falling off, there's no more room for anything else. Some of it may go cold, some of it you don't want anyhow. Just go back for seconds if more needs to be done, but don't load it all in the first place. So, okay, that's the scenario in terms of hovering around the maximum. And as Deborah quite correctly says here, we're not giving you an extra 10%. There's nothing wishy-washy here. At the University of Wolverhampton, when you submit a form where you declare what the word count is. So don't think that no one's checking on this stuff either, or somehow it's not apparent to those involved in receiving the thesis and examining the thesis. But let me just talk for a second as well about ambiguities around word count as well, because I have quite a lot of discussion around this, and it can be that some of the questions I get are quite hard to answer. So, for example, sometimes people will include graphics, graphs, charts that include words, maybe word clouds, which somehow wind up in the word count and can actually add quite a bit to the word count. And they would question then whether that is reasonably counted against the word count. Okay, so that's one area of ambiguity. Another area of ambiguity is whether footnotes, endnotes, and references are counted. Well, in fact, they are, apart from references in some disciplinary areas. And I think you would need to check very clearly with your university's regulations in terms of what is and what isn't in. Most typically across the sector, an appendix won't be counted as word count. So if, for example, you've transcribed interviews that you need to submit with the thesis, but this is an assessed material, but nonetheless it needs to go in, then that would be in an appendix that's off word count. I mean, the other ambiguity is where you're adding stuff as JPEGs or images that therefore wouldn't be detected by the word count on Word, but nonetheless may or may not be word count. So that there can be some ambiguities. And all I would say is please don't put yourself into an ambiguous situation. I would just steer clear of somehow having to get rid of 10 words here and 8 words there and 6 words here. And, that's work that you don't really want to be doing. I would just give yourself a bit of space to maneuver.
So I think that's really good advice. So basically, it's a good idea to check what is included in the word count and what isn't included in the word count. So at Wolverhampton, the references are included in the word count for PhDs, but not included in the word count for professional doctorates, prof docs, and ancillary data that goes into the appendix isn't counted in the word count, but your ancillary data cannot exceed more than 20% of the total length of your thesis. So if you are doing, for instance, a PhD in education where there's a 90,000 word word count, maximum word count, the ancillary data shouldn't be any more than 18,000 words. So we've started to talk a little bit about what is and what isn't included. So I think it would be useful to talk about how we can plan to keep under the word count. So Ben, have you got any tips or ideas around how to make sure that we've talked about how important it is to have a balanced thesis, that you know, that your sections are balanced and that they cover everything that they need to cover in other vlogs. But how do you plan for that, and how do you use that to help keep you under the maximum word count?
I think initially, very early on as a doctoral researcher, you panic because you think, I have to generate tens of thousands of words. I've never done this before. I mean, if I've done a master's, it might have been a tenth of the size of a doctoral thesis, and that was as much as I could manage. And you may translate that panic into just writing, probably of stuff that may not necessarily wind up in the thesis, which itself generates quite a lot of work that you would be better to avoid. So I think what I would do is, with a calculator, is begin to spec out your table of content. So how many words would be appropriate for literature review? How many words are we thinking about for this case study? And in doing that, you're also, I suppose, in a way, creating a timeline yourself. You know, so this summer I will attempt to generate the 15,000 words that I've allotted to case study 3, which makes life a lot easier, and it puts in a series of goals that you can hit without too much trouble, rather than just looking at a blank screen thinking I have to write tens of thousands of words. So I think that kind of organization is important. But at the other end of it, when you've got a draft thesis, when perhaps it is looking like it's heading over word count, but you're still 6 months away from submission, so there's time to do stuff about it, I think at that point you may begin to wonder what you can do to pull it back to a more manageable body of work that's also within the regulatory word count position. I think you can have some conversations with your supervisors. Is this really relevant? Could this go? I think you can begin to try and restrain yourself from jumping down the rabbit hole. I think in those last few months, there can be quite a lot of chasing after additional material that might simply result in one more footnote. And at a certain point, I think you might need to demarcate what is relevant and what's very interesting, but not necessarily relevant and is burning word count you don't have to burn. If you're looking at a thesis that really is over, to the tune of a few thousand words, I mean, one quick fix would be to look at the endnotes or the footnotes or whatever referencing section, referencing that you're using. And if you can find something already to an endnote or a footnote, it seems that it may not be necessary, and it may be slightly less painful to simply start deleting these, or to mark them in the thesis as material that could be deleted without interrupting the flow of the thesis itself, which is a much more difficult thing to do. Another thing is, if there is superfluous material, if you're quoting from a transcribed interview, a few bits and pieces, but you don't really need the whole transcribed interview in the middle of the thesis, just put it into an appendix where it's off word count. That's another operation that many doctoral researchers would go through. So yeah, so I think there are some tips there in terms of bringing something back in under word count at that late stage.
I think also you can add there is repetition, because often we will talk about things, the same thing in different places in the thesis, and maybe going back and finding all of those places where you've referred to something and take out the reference and just signpost to one place in the thesis where it's discussed in more detail, and that can save quite a lot of words. The other thing is also looking at your titles, looking at your headings and subheadings. The more concise they are, the clearer they are. So try not to have wordy or lengthy titles and subtitles. So again, going back through those and looking at how you might take some of those words out of your word count can also help there. So thank you, Ben.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, let's say as well that it's a point of stress, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's important to, just for me to make this final note. On the one hand, I've said you were in a kind of panic mode. How do I generate all this stuff? On at the other end of it, you're in a panic mode. There's too much. What do I get rid of? So I think it's important to know that this matter of word count really impacts on your well-being, I think. And so the stuff that Deborah and I have talked about today isn't just a matter of a few tools to get stuff how it should be. It's actually also a matter of levels of stress and concern and anxiety and these things that can, be reflected in this matter of word count. So look after yourself by thinking about some of these tips.
And I think it's also important to say, if you do remove content from your thesis, it's never lost, because this is information that you can use for publications. So it often, I see some of my students who are doing professional doctorates who have a 45,000 word count, have to take out really lovely arguments that they've put into their thesis, but actually they go on to then write those arguments up as papers for beyond their doctorate. So nothing is ever lost. If you take it out, it's still there and you can still use it. So thank you for listening. As always, if there's anything that you would like us to cover in these vlogs, please do let us know. Please pop them down, ideas down into the comments, and we will cover the areas. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe. So click the bell and you'll be notified when we upload, and we try to upload on a regular basis. So thank you for listening, and we will speak to you again soon. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.